Although you're crying on the inside, are you wondering what else can I do? Sometimes you tip you, sometimes you say, I'm not gonna tip that nigga, you don't look for no tip. Yes, sir, thank you. What did you say? Come back, because I take care of you. Don't talk to him like that. That's a good nigga. That's my nigga. Oh, yes, sir, boss. I'm your nigga. I'm trying to make a living. Why? I got 3 children. I want them to get an education. I wasn't fortunate enough to get an education, but I want them to get it. And they are doing good. Night after night, I lay down and I dream about what I had to go through with. I don't want my children to have to go through with that. I want them to be able to get the job that they be qualified for. That's what I'm struggling for. I don't want this and I don't want that, but I just don't want my children to have to go through what I go through with. Hey, tell that nigga to hurry with that coffee. I'm on my way. So that's what you have to go through with. But remember, you have to keep that smile.
This is Booker Wright. The white men we've just seen and heard think he's a hard-working, carefree Negro. But what does he think? He has his own place in the Negro district where he works by day. But at night, he waits on white folks.
Some people are nice, some is not. Some call me Booker, some call me John, some call me Jim, some call me nigga. All of that hurt, but you have to smile. If you don't, what's wrong with you? Why are you not smiling? Get over there and get me so-and-so and so-and-so. Always learn to smile. The meaner the man be, the more you smile. Although you're crying on the inside. Are you wondering what else can I do?
I had a talk with Booker, and I said, are you sure you want to do this? This picture's going to play all over the South, and they're going to watch you, in a sense, ridicule them as being fools. The time has come. I got to talk the way I feel.
When I saw it, I thought to myself, you're a dead man. They are going to kill you. And then I thought, he knows that. He understands exactly what he's saying.
One of the policemen met Booker and just beat the hell out of him with a pistol.
They destroyed his store. They came and practically bombed it.
No one really pretended that justice was meted out on an equal basis between whites and blacks.
I knew there was going to be a killing.
I recall passing by him with the shotgun on the way to kill your grandfather.
I think that I should have just not used it. I really do.
All right, Shalom. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham Yahweh Shai, Bahasham Rachak Kodash. I want to give double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well. In grace and peace to you elect around the 4 winds, believing and pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. This is your fellow servant, Rakoya from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another impromptu lesson. And the title of tonight's lesson is We Are No Longer Slaves to Trauma. All right. And the inspiration for this lesson comes from the video that you're seeing at the beginning, going into the account of Booker Wright from Greenwood, Mississippi, back in the 70s. You know, and I want to get into this lesson through the spirit, man, because Booker Wright is a prime example of the character that our people have adopted due to the trauma that we've experienced growing up here in Babylon the Great. You know, especially the Israelite man, you know, due to the years, the decades of constant sore strokes being laid upon our nation, you know, our people have become slaves to trauma. You know, it's turned them into people pleasers, you know, who have developed a codependency on the enemy. You know, and through the spirit, the gospel has freed us from those bonds of trauma. You know, let me get that. This is John chapter 8 and verse 32. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. You know, through the spirit, the truth, you know, has loosed the bounds of this world for us to, you know, to hopefully elect. You know, the truth, the gospel has loosed the bounds of this world, and we are no longer slaves to the trauma that we've experienced in Babylon the Great. You know, now the Lord is reinvigorating us. You know, he's reinventing, you know, the Israelite man, or renewing the Israelite man through the Spirit of Yahweh Shai. And now our confidence is rooted in the Lord rather than rooted in pleasing the enemy, and what we can provide for our enemies. Now our confidence is rooted in our service to the Lord, and our ability to reach the Lord, reach the Lord through our prayer, through our connection in the Spirit. It says again, John 8:32, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Now we are no longer codependents of Esau, Edom. All right. We are no longer bound by the trauma that we have experienced. All right. This is Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 20. All right. It says, and it shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel and such as are escaped of the house of Jacob shall no more again stay upon him that smote them, but shall stay upon the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. All right, and now, it's beginning now with the remnant who are no longer staying upon him that smote us. All right, which, let me get that in the NLT. Isaiah 10 and 20 in the NLT. In that day, the remnant left in Israel, the survivors in the house of Jacob, will no longer depend on allies who seek to destroy them, but they will faithfully trust in the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. We no longer seek after the very ones that sought to destroy us. We no longer put our trust and our confidence in an ally that ultimately has sought out to destroy us from the foundation. Because this feud is a perpetual hatred. Brothers were getting into that this past Saturday at camp. This feud that is, taking place today really isn't a new feud. It's nothing that has newly arisen in the earth. This is a perpetual hatred that has been perpetuated throughout generations. All right. Going back into, the womb. The two babies, Jacob and Esau, were at odds in the womb. And since the womb, it's developed into this point to where, now under this Babylonian captivity, Esau has had the upper hand for generations and has been allowed to lay sore strokes on the nation of Israel, and turn us into shells of ourselves. Because when you look at Booker Wright, that's a shell of a man. It's really sad, to see how far we've fallen as a nation and as men of the nation of Israel. When you look at the different accounts of our forefathers, Yahweh Shai, King David, King Solomon, Elijah, Elisha, Apostle Paul, the Apostle Peter, men of great valor and valiance, of great courage, who stood down to no heathen, and to see where we've come from that point till now is very humbling, only for the remnant. For the remnant, it's a very humbling experience. It's shown us how far we've fallen and how, how much we've transgressed against the Lord and how much we need the Lord. And it's led to another, level of repentance among us. A sorrowful nation, a contrite heart. It's led to a contrite heart for those of us of the hopeful elect. Because we hate to see our people like that, man. Because that's still going on today. That coping, that is constantly taught to our people to fit in amongst these nations. We ultimately have adopted a culture of trimming our ways. This is Jeremiah 23, 2 and verse 33. Why trimmest thou thy way to seek love? Therefore hast thou also taught the wicked one thy ways. All right. And then through the Spirit, man, what we've developed, is a trimming, a culture of trimming our ways, to seek validation, to seek acceptance, and love. when the very people that we've been seeking that from have been seeking to destroy us from the foundation. And it's only due to a lack of knowledge that our people continually strive to seek acceptance from the so-called white man. And it shows you, how far we've fallen, because all our people do is seek acceptance. They don't even seek to be equal. They don't even seek to be over, lords over our enemies. They just want to be accepted. They still believe, at the end of the day, that they're inferior. This trauma has developed an inferiority complex within our nation. And it shows every day, how our people are marching, to save their lives and, fighting to be equal, fighting, to be on equal footing with the so-called white man, and his penal codes and his laws. The inferiority complex shows daily. How you'll have a Jake walking down the street. As soon as, a so-called white man passes by, he straightens himself up. Straightens himself up, straightens his speech up, straightens his back up, starts walking upright, pulls his pants up. Yes, sir. No, ma'am. The evidence of that trauma is there daily, and through the Spirit, man, the gospel has freed us from that yoke. We are no longer codependent on the so-called white man. We're no longer stayed upon him that smote us. I tapped it into ChatGPT. I said, what is it called when someone constantly tries to appease someone or people who constantly mistreat or abuse them? It says, when someone constantly tries to please or abuse people who please or appease people who mistreat, manipulate, or abuse them, there are several terms that might apply, depending on the context. People pleasing, prioritizing others' approval over avoiding contact, even at one's own expense. This is the broadest term, which we've seen in the video, at Booker Wright's own expense. He was, seeking the approval of others, seeking the approval of the so-called white man ultimately, which ultimately got him killed, because after that interview, the so-called white man hired another Jake to go off him, paid him some money to go off him, which is another curse, the eye being evil toward our own brethren. That's only escalated, through the sore strokes that have been laid upon our nation. But it says fawning, a trauma response in which someone attempts to stay safe by appeasing, pleasing, or accommodating an abusive or threatening person, which is exactly what he was describing in the video. Along with fight, flight, and freeze, many psychologists recognize fawn as other common response to perceived danger. Trauma bonding. It says a strong emotional attachment that can develop between an abused person and their abuser, making it difficult to leave or stop seeking the abuser's approval. And just made me think of this. This is Matthew chapter 12 and verse 29. Or else how can one enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he first bind the strong man, and then he will spoil his house? And to overtake the nation of Israel, the so-called white man had to bind the strong man. He had to bind the men of our nation first. And that came through buck breaking, the constant sore strokes that were laid upon us during the time of slavery, chattel slavery, that led to the complete breaking down of the mentality and spirit of the Israelite man. And from that point forward, the so-called white man was able to come in and conquer the nation of Israel, to the point to where we see the remnants of that conquering in men like Booker Wright and 2/3 of our people, even us, when we are still of the world. We show remnants of that conquering. He bound a strong man. But through the Spirit, we are no longer bound. All right, like we read in John 8:32, the truth has made us free. And now we're under the yoke of Yahushua. All right, the truth has made us free. And now the light of truth has shined upon us. And we're starting to arise. This is Isaiah chapter 58. Like 60, slacking. Isaiah chapter 60. Arise, shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. All right, the glory of the Lord is now risen upon the remnant. All right, which is pulling them out of the gross darkness that we've been subject to for years, for generations. You know, the Lord is pulling us out of that by this glorious light of truth. It says, for behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the people. But the Lord shall arise upon thee, and his glory shall be seen upon thee. All right. And gross darkness has overtaken our nation as a whole. But now we're starting to see the light arise upon the remnant, the Lord shining his light upon the remnant and giving them the spirit and the vitality to fight against this trauma, you know, to fight against the wiles of the devil. Like it says in Ephesians, the 6th chapter, you know, the Lord has put back that fighting spirit within the Israelite man. You know, the prophecy in Genesis said that, you know, Judah is a lion's whelp. Okay. This is Genesis 49 and verse 9. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? You know, through that binding, you know, Judah became a crouched lion, an old lion, which represents docileness, you know, conformity and codependence, like we're reading, you know, all of those traits that we read on ChatGPT, trauma bonding, fawning, people pleasing. All right, a crouched lion happened to the nation, first, you know, chiefly through Judah, which is the head tribe of the nation of Israel, and it's spread throughout the nation of Israel. You know, but at the end it says, who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a log even from between his feet until Shiloh come. Speaking about Yahushua, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. All right, and who is raising up that crouched lion? The Lord. All right, read in Isaiah 60, arise and shine. The Lord is causing Judah, you know, first and foremost, the head tribe of the nation of Israel, to rise up now in these latter days through the Spirit, and through Judah rising, and the rest of the nation is rising. The rest of the nation of Israel is rising. Excuse me. And taking a stand. All right, taking a stand. All right, against those who smote us, like it says in Wisdom of Solomon, the 5th chapter. All right, that's why, you know, our salvation is going to be so strange, you know, to the nations, because nobody ever thought that this would be the final outcome, you know, at the end. Nobody thought that this will be a part of the ending credits for Negroes, Latinos, and Native Indians to be saved, you know, by UAPs and a dark-skinned man named Yahushua, you know, and given peace and rest on earth. Nobody ever thought that that would be in our end credits. That's why the salvation is going to be strange, and that's why the salvation is going to be magnificent. Because to see from how far we've fallen to how high the Lord is getting ready to raise us up is something that only a divine power can do. You know, it's only through divine intervention. At ChatGPT, it says codependency, a pattern where someone becomes overly focused on meeting another person's needs, often neglecting their own, even in unhealthy or abusive relationships. And all of this is describing our relationship, you know, the nation of Israel's relationship with the so-called white man. Even to this day, you know, outside of the remnant, which have now been loosed from these bounds, all right, and been made free through the spirit and power of Yahweh Bahasham Yahushai. It says, learn helplessness. After repeating mistreatment, a person may come to believe they cannot change the situation and continue trying to adapt to it instead of leaving. You know, that's why it said in Malachi, you know, you had those men that said, what profit is it to us to serve the Lord? It's vain to serve the Lord. You know, because they learn helplessness. You know, they see no end to the problem. They see no solution. Therefore, they conform to the problem instead of trying to seek out a solution to the problem. It says Stockholm Syndrome, which we get into all the time through the Spirit. You already know what that is, man. You know, but all that, you know, has been loose through the Spirit and power of Yahweh by Shem Yahushai. And we are no longer slaves to trauma. All right, even though we deal with our own perspective traumas, you know, daily, you know, through the Spirit of the Lord. You know, and some of it still, you know, rears its head from time to time because we're in the flesh. You know, we have the brotherhood here, though. You know, we have tools set in place to combat that trauma, you know, from overtaking us again, such as the brotherhood, such as reading these e-epistles, making these e-epistles, all right, fellowship, you know, teaching on the highways and byways, all right, the Lord, fasting, you know, the Lord has given us tools to combat the trauma, all right, and to no longer be bound and controlled by it. You know, so the water Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai. That's why this truth is not to be taken for granted. You got to realize how much Yahushai has done for us by giving us this comforter. Yahushai has did so much for us, from laying his life down to allowing us to come back into the light in the latter days and to loose the bounds of trauma. We are no longer bound, Aki. You know, and it's our service now to help those of us who are still, you know, struggling with that. That's why, you know, the scriptures say that not to forsake the assembling of one another. Because you know, if you've been around the body, you know. It's a constant labor. It's a constant work. But it's what our spirits were forced to do. This is why we were put in the planet Earth, to do this work. You know, the Lord is likened unto a physician, and us being stewards of the Lord, you know, us being students of the Lord and servants of the Lord, you know, in a sense, we are spiritual physicians as well, you know, spiritual detectives, as the elder Kasamagan from the DC camp put it, spiritual detectives, you know, spiritual psychiatrists, you know, helping one another, you know, in different aspects and where we lack, you know, in different aspects where we have, you know, trauma in some cases, and helping each other get through it through the Spirit and power of Yahweh Shem Yahushai. You know, it's all this ministry is multifold, man. It's deep. It's deep. How deep the Spirit of Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai goes, man. You know, and we can only appreciate it as the Lord reveals it. You know, as we continue to increase in the Spirit, the more we see and the more we appreciate. You know, but with that being said, that's all I had. You know, Lord, when this letter found unto you elect, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai B'Shem